Hello everyone, Ethan here, and welcome to the third introduction lecture in our intro series. Now, it's obvious from the structure of the board that today's lecture is going to be a little bit different, as in it's not going to ask a fundamental question necessarily. If you'll remember from the first lecture, we asked the question, why study typology, and I proceeded to describe all of the reasons why typology is a useful metric of study. And in the second lecture, I asked the question, what is socionics, and proceeded to describe socionics as a field. But in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the origins of socionics, basically how the model was created, how it was discovered, the influences that it had in creation, and its context in psychology as a whole. So, without further ado, let's get started. As many of you know, in antiquity, many philosophers tried to describe the impact of individual differences on people's personality as a whole. In ancient Greece, Hippocrates described the four temperaments, sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, and melancholic, in an attempt to describe how biological differences could cause personality differences. And obviously, many philosophers throughout history, in the absence of science, tried to create these sorts of typologies to very little success. So it's obvious that in the early 1900s, with the given birth of psychoanalysis and general psychology, people were once again fascinated by this question of individual personality and how differences in somebody's personality could contribute to their social role. In the early 1900s, though, this study was restricted to the study of pathology and mental disorders, the idea being that if somebody's personality was far enough from the norm of behavior, their personality differences could be studied and isolated to a sufficient enough degree that their psychological motivations could be studied in greater detail. And that was part of the work of Anton Kapinski. But in the 1920s, Carl Jung did something revolutionary. He created a framework of neurotypical personality that was arguably more philosophical than the rest. He created a framework where normal people and average individuals could be studied according to their personality differences in the theory of 8 psychological types. Now, this theory utilized mandalas of information, intuition, sensation, thinking, and feeling to categorize how average and everyday people manifest personality differences in the world around them. And he used the creation of dichotomies, such as extroversion, introversion, intuition, sensing, thinking, feeling, and rational, irrational, to describe how different people go about their lives in many different ways. Now, fast forwarding to the time period now, modern Jungian psychology utilizes 16 psychological types to describe individual differences based on the strength of the 2 first and foremost cognitive functions. Now, this theory works well enough, and in and of itself is enough to study, which is why it was basically imported to the United States with the creation of the Myers-Briggs type indicator. The MBTI studies these 16 psychological types as they are, in and of themselves, using metrics of dichotomies in order to study people's individual differences. But a theory of how people interact with each other and how those individual differences could contribute to larger group differences had not yet been created in sufficient enough detail. Now, as the story goes, the founder of Socionics, Ausra Augusta, was mulling over some fundamental problems of human existence in Vilnius, Lithuania in the 1970s when she encountered a set of psychological theories: Freud's conception of the ego, id, and superego, Ernst Kretschmer's conception of the psychosomatic types, and Tony Kepinski's formation of the information metabolism, and most importantly, Carl Jung's theory of psychological types. Now, according to the theory of psychological types, each person can be assigned to one psychological type. Ausra Augusta used the theory of information metabolism to translate psychological types into the language of cybernetics, construing each person as a cybernetic unit with one of 16 potential architectures. Now, Ausra Augusta was especially interested in the theory of family problems. In her work in sociology, she observed various marriages, some of which were extremely successful and worked out well, and others which ended horribly and resulted in psychological stress for both members involved. She concluded that this was probably due to personality differences between the individuals, but she had not yet encountered a framework that allowed her to make these judgments and expound upon them in great detail. That situation changed when she first read about Anton Kapinski, a 1960s Swiss psychiatrist's work in information metabolism. And as I discussed earlier, she used this conception of information metabolism. Anton Kapinski talked about how pathologies and mental disorders can influence somebody's information metabolism, causing negative effects in their lives. Augusta generalized this to the theory of Carl Jung's psychological types, stating that two partners who have incompatible types will cause a disruption in each other's information metabolism, while two partners with compatible psychological types will have a beneficial effect on each other's information metabolism. And this can be predicted within the modern framework of socionics. So, together with the theory of fellow researchers, she created Model A of the psyche, introducing new concepts, many of which we continue to study in detail today. Following its creation, a number of socialists have contributed to Model A and introduced many new concepts into the context of socionics. In the Russian hemisphere, the four most notable of these socionists are Grigory Reinin, who created the Reinin dichotomies, Alexander Bukolov, who created the concept of dimensionality, Vladimir Ermak, who created systems theory in the context of socionics, otherwise known as the School of System Socionics, or the SSS, and Viktor Gulenko, who made a number of important changes to Model A, including the introduction of small groups, including quadras, communication styles, romance styles, etc. Now, in the Russian sphere, there are two schools that sort of dominate socionics as a whole. There's Ausra's school in Moscow, which Grigory Reinin used to be a part of, and there is the Kiev school in Ukraine, including Alexander Bukolov, Ermak, and Gulenko, which today occupies the leading school in the Ukraine and the Eastern Hemisphere. Now, it's obvious that many of you watching this video are from the Western Hemisphere who are studying this in English. I'm speaking English right now. So what's up with the theory's Eastern creation and its transition to the West? Well, it's obvious that socionics is not nearly as popular as the Myers-Briggs, since the Myers-Briggs originated here in the US. The Myers-Briggs is, according to Google searches, I believe, 7.6 times more popular than the socionics model, and that is for a number of reasons. First of all, Myers-Briggs is much more simple than the socionic model. It's easy to master the dichotomies, it's easy to understand the types in the Myers-Briggs, and there's not a whole lot of interaction between them, just the cognitive functions, the types, and the dichotomies. Another reason for that is the Iron Curtain in the Cold War in the 1970s and 80s that prevented the spread of socionics to the West. And perhaps a third reason is the philosophical nature of socionics, which may not be as appealing or as interesting as the simplicity, again, of the Myers-Briggs framework in discussing personality differences. But the modern state of socionics is not something that I'm going to cover here. In fact, it's something that I'm going to be covering in the next lecture. So I hope the origins of socionics, I hope you learned something about how socionics was created. I hope this enlightened you on how the model proceeded from, influences to advances. And I will see you all in the next lecture.